And this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. We will continue review of CDFM Module 2, Competency 1, the Defense Budget Process. If at any time you have questions, if you're on Facebook, you may have to type your questions and I get back with you later. If you're on the phone line, you're welcome to stop me at any time to ask a question. All right, let me put on my glasses. All right, so last week we went through the beginning part of CDFM Module 2.1. We looked at the key players in the DoD and then looked at some of their functions. So what I'm going to do is kind of recap some of that information, and then we will continue and finish up with 2.1. As you're studying for the exam, it's important for you to review. As I mentioned, repetition, repetition, repetition. You cannot just pick up the information in bits and pieces. You got to be able to understand it as a whole. So that's what we're going to do. So we started off by looking at the mission of the Department of Defense to provide security, provide safety of our allies, and so forth. And based on the mission of the Department of Defense, then we have a particular structure. We looked at the historical background of the services, military services, or departments. This is the Army, Navy, Marine, Air Force, and then we identified the Space Force that was recently established in 2019. Then we went specifically into the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and we looked at the roles of such as the USD for Research and Engineering, USD for Policy, Personnel, the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, and so forth. And so you're going to have to know those individual roles and what they're responsible for. So we kind of identified some of that. So based on the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, it identified a chairman. So actually, let me go back. Back to page 219 with the history. So the National Security Act of 1947 established a number of things that we're going to talk about. The National Security Council, the CIA, Intelligence Agency, the Civilian Secretary of Defense, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So I think that this law is important for you to know because every one of these agencies or key individuals play a major role in how we get our resources. So it's important to know that it was based on the National Security Act of 1947. All right, so moving on around page 12, you have the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986. So remember, 47, we already had Joint Chiefs of Staff. Army had its own representative, Navy had its own representative, and so forth. And so it wasn't until 1986 that they identified a chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff to be the one spokesperson to tie in everything that the services together need for their mission. So the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is that military advisor. And we're going to look closely at what he does. All right. On page 13, we went over the chairman's role and the vice chairman. The vice chairman is important of the Joint Chief of Staff because he is the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, the JROC, and he's also a co-chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board. Remember, we talked about 3 DoD support system, 1, 2, 3. 3 systems that helps the Department of Defense make decisions. JCID, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System, that identifies capability gap. Once you know what the mission is, then you need to figure out, okay, what assets do we have and what capability gaps do we as a warfighter have to meet that mission. Once the capability gap is identified, looking at .MLPF, doctrine, organization, training, material, equipment, and all of that, leader development. If it's anything other than material, it triggers the Ppbe system. That's the second system. If the requirement to fill that capability gap in JCIDS is a material solution, we need new aircrafts, new equipment, new systems, then it triggers the acquisition system. So the three systems are JCIDS, Ppbe, and the Defense Acquisition System. So keep that in the back of your mind as you're going through the information, that the role that these individuals play fall into one of those systems. They're doing it in one of those systems. So it makes sense that the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff role is to tie in that short-term and long-term requirements. He helps to identify the capability gaps in the JROC or the JCIDS process, and then he also sits on the acquisition process or acquisition system. And we'll go into more of this when we attack 2.2, cost and economic analysis. We talked about the 11 combatant commands in the different regions. The operational chain of command runs from the president through the SecDef to those combatant commanders. So the resources are also aligned in that manner. So how does things begin? Everything begins with the establishment of the national strategy. The National Security Council, which we said was established with that 1947. It's made up of the president, the vice president, the SecDef, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Energy, and the Secretary of the Treasury. Those are the primary members. You have two advisors, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, which is the top military advisor to the president, to the Secretary of Defense, or to the National Security Council, and the Director of National Intelligence. So all I'm doing is flipping the page, and everything that I identify as important on that page, I'm just recapping. That's the same thing you need to do. So the National Security Council, they sit and they do analysis. They identify what type of strategy the country needs to have based on threats, based on finances, resources, etc. So I say that they produce the big op order, which is called the National Security Strategy. So if everybody's part of the DoD, Department of Defense, then you should be familiar with the term Operation Order. So what do you do when you get Operation Order from your higher? You take it, you go through it, and you determine what are your requirements based on that order. So the DoD takes the NSS, National Security Strategy, and then determine what are the defense-related missions in that order. And based on what the DoD decisions are to meet that strategy, the DoD will then present the National Defense Strategy. They'll also give the National Military Strategy. So the defense strategy comes from the SecDef, but the author of the National Military Strategy is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So that's a little bit different. Remember, your president is a civilian, your SecDef is a civilian, your top military person or advisor to those individuals is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So it makes sense that he will write the National Military Strategy. All right, so some of the key players we discussed last week, the USD Comptroller, which along being the Chief Financial Officer, etc., he's also the one in charge of the budgeting phase and the execution phase of Ppbe process. So again, when you're studying, read through everything, but I'm just going to point out some important things because they tie in elsewhere. All right, what else? We have on page 24, we look at the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And when you read through their description, you see that the USD for Policy is in charge of the planning phase of Ppbe. So for each one of those phases, remember I said JCIDS, Ppbe, and the Defense Acquisition System. What I'm doing now is identifying the individual, the title of that position that's in charge of those phases. So I already said JCIDS has oversight by the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. and he utilizes the JROC, Joint Requirements Oversight Council, to do that analysis. The planning phase of Ppbe, we just stated, is the USD for policy, under Secretary of Defense for policy. So if you get a multiple choice and they said at the DOD level who is responsible for the planning phase of Ppbe, if you pick something that says Assistant Secretary of the Army for policy, you are wrong. All the titles except for one, the DOD level is under Secretary of Defense, USD. So it's USD for policy. We don't go down to the service level, so don't let them trick you like that. All right, page 25, Under Secretary of Defense, Acquisition and Sustainment. This used to be the U.S. Under Secretary of Defense, Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. Now the name is Acquisition and Sustainment. So this is the title of the individual in charge of the Defense Acquisition System, that third system. So DAS, Defense Acquisition System, is the responsibility of the USD-ANS. The Undersecretary of Defense, this is also a new one, of Research and Engineering, is the CIO, Information Technology Officer. Information Officer, Technology, Research, and Engineering. That's a new one from the older study guides if you have one of those. And page 27, the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. This is the only one, let me make sure I think, yeah, the only one that does not start with USD, Under Secretary of Defense. So the individual in charge of cost analysis, he's got several roles. He's in charge of the programming phase of Ppbe. He's also in charge of updating the future year defense program that we're going to talk about, FYDP. So there's a lot of roles played by the DK, but Director of Cost Assessment, this is the only one that does not start, his position does not start with USD, Under Secretary of Defense. And if you want to know what the three systems look like on paper, on page 2128, they give you the diagram, and you can see how all three overlap to meet the National Defense Strategy. And remember, the purpose of the National Defense Strategy is to meet the big op order, which is the National Security Strategy. Okay, so I just got you caught up from last week, and now we're going to pick up on page 2131. Going a little bit deeper into the planning phase of Ppbe. So what you got to ask yourself, who's in charge of the planning phase of Ppbe? Even if it's not directly on that page, we just went over it, so you need repetition, repetition, repetition. So the USD for policy is what we studied a few minutes ago, is in charge of the planning phase of Ppbe. So, and then at the bottom of page 31, what they're telling you there, the final document that is presented at the end of the planning phase of Ppbe is the Defense Planning Guidance, the DPG. So at the end of each phase, there's a final document that is published. So at the end of the National Security Council coming together, they publish the National Security Strategy. At the end, once the DOD gets the National Security Strategy, they produce the National Defense Strategy, the National Military Strategy, Homeland Security, Joint Planning Guidance then comes into play starting on page 31. But know that the final document on page 31 is telling you, when you go through all of that, that the final document will be the Defense Planning Guidance. So on page 32, it's telling you the process that is going through for the planning phase of Ppbe. The purpose of the plan now is, now we have a defense planning guidance. We have a strategy. We have what we want to do. Now we need to see, can we do it? Does it make sense? So part of the planning process is taking all of those documents as listed there in the middle of page 32 to then determine, can we meet our strategy? Do we have the resources already in-house? Or do we need additional funding from Congress? Do we need additional personnel, equipment, and so forth? That's done in the planning phase of Ppbe. And when you read the second paragraph on page 32, it tells you what triggers the planning phase. The process begins when the combatant commanders provide the SecDef and the chairman with their requirements. Now let's pause for a minute. Who can remember? When the combatant commanders submit their issues, their concerns, what is the document called? The document is called the IPL, Integrated Priority List. That is the combatant commanders notifying the SecDef, the chairman, and the services of their shortfall, what requirements. Remember, the combatant commanders don't own the resources. They just in charge of those regions. So they have to get their resources. They do not do their own POM or budget requests. They got to submit it to the service. So their notification, the planning phase of P begins when the combatant commanders submit their requirements. So page 34, it mentions the integrated priority list. Okay, I kind of jumped the gun there, but it's there on page 34 if you want to see what it's talking about. So IPL is only associated with the combatant commanders. So for test-taking purposes, whenever you say combatant commanders, the document they produce is integrated priority list. Too easy. All right, so that's the planning phase. And what's the final document in the planning phase of P? DPG, Defense Planning Guidance. All right, we got that out the way. So we know who is in charge of it, and we know the final document, what triggers the process, IPLs, and the final document is the DPG. So on page 35, the programming phase of P. Who did we say is in charge of the programming phase of P? That was the DK, Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. So you can read through all the paragraphs on page 35, but the end result, remember, you got to tie the information in the front to this page. The DK is in charge of programming, providing guidance before the programming phase begins. I also stated that the DK is in charge of updating the future year defense program, and we're going to look at that in a little bit. When it comes to the acquisition side, the DK does the analysis of the alternative. You'll hear those terms when you come to the acquisition side of the house. So anything dealing with cost analysis, cost benefit analysis, the DK is the person in charge. So when in doubt and they say cost, just pick DK, right? All right, page 36. So part of the programming phase, which most of us are familiar with, is establishment of the POM. Those are the programs that we want approval to operate, to get funded. So as you can see, in the spring of the year, the director at the top of page 36, the DCAPE and the USD Comptroller, who is in charge of budget and execution, they send guidance to the field on how to develop the POM, develop the budget estimate submission. So the POM, and then you also want to know, okay, what's the end result? So keep that in your mind. What's the final document at the end of the POM? All right, so Fydp, page 37. So remember I said the DCAPE is in charge of the programming phase. The DCAPE is in charge of updating the FYDP, Future Year Defense Program, on page 2137. So what is the FYDP? That is a DoD database. Let's see if they got the picture on this one. Yep, I like pictures because it's easy to remember. So if you want to flip to page 38, the FYDP is a DoD database that keeps track of the 12, and this is different from other older study guides, because it used to be 11 major force programs. Now there are 12, meaning every mission the Department of Defense conducts falls into one of these 12 force programs, in these programs. So the programs are utilized by the services or the military departments, and they can utilize various appropriations to get the mission accomplished. So that's what the diagram is telling you. So the purpose of the Fydp is for that DCAPE to keep track as we're going through the Ppbe process, the Future Year Defense Program, and things change. The DCAPE is responsible for updating the Fydp. All right, 12 programs, you did that. When you submit your POMs and the POM goes through that process, understand that coming from the military department, it goes to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who then gets reviewed by the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, right? Because they speak military, and then the chairman will provide his assessment, CPA on page 41, to the SecDef. So the Program Decision Memorandum, the PDM, is the final document in the programming phase of P. So planning phase, the final document was the Defense Planning Guidance. Programming, the final document after the chairman gives his assessment to the SecDef and the final decision is made on programs that's going to be approved. Then the Program Decision Memorandum is the final document at the end of the programming phase of P. And at the same time, the DCAPE is updating the Future Year Defense Program. Ppbe, Plan, Program, Budget. On page 2142, you go into the budgeting phase of P. Who's in charge of budget? The USD Comptroller is in charge of the budgeting phase of P. So now budgeting is translating those programs into appropriation language so that they can request the adequate appropriation to go with the programs. 2143 talks about the budget estimate submission. So that's the formal title of the budgeting phase, BES, the best budget estimate submission. So each DoD component submits a BES to OSD no later than the due date specified. So they're given budget review guidance, and within that they'll have a suspense when they need to submit their budget request. On page 2144, part of that budget process is for OSD and Office of Management and Budget. Oh, who's OMB? We never talked about them. So let's look at hierarchy. So I'm going to pause from the information in front of me now so we can go over some hierarchy things that you should have picked up in Module 1 or even in Module 3. Congress has the Congressional Budget Office. Congress also has the Government Accountability Office, which is an external auditing agency that works directly for Congress to monitor how we are spending the funds. So Congress has the Congressional Budget Office. The President or the executive branch has the the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. So the President has OMB to do their budget, Chief Financial Officer at the executive branch. Then the DoD has the USD Comptroller. That is the level that you need to know. From the DoD level, USD Comptroller, to OMB, which works for the executive branch or the President, and Congress has a Congressional Budget Office and also the GAO to do that, provide that oversight. So on page 2144, when you see OSD, Office of the Secretary of Defense, and Office of Management and Budget doing a budget review, that fall review, if you read through that paragraph, is them doing a scrub of the requirements of what the OSD is requesting for the budget. They do a fall review. At the end of the fall review, so understand in the fall review, I'm sure that the USD Comptroller is not going to agree with some of the requirements, or they may bump up some of the other funding requests, appropriation. But the bottom line, at the end of that fall review, when the final decision is made between OSD and OMB, the final document is the program budget decision in the budgeting phase. So we got Defense Planning Guidance at the end of the planning phase. We have the Program Decision Memorandum at the end of the programming phase, and the Program Budget Decision at the end of the budget phase. Now in the budgeting phase of P, there's an introduction of a new system outside of the Future Year Defense Program. Another system used in the budgeting phase to keep track of the numbers is the Comptroller Information System, the CIS, on page 2145. So it's also an automated system that is updated in the USD Comptroller's office to keep track of either increases, decreases, to know what the final numbers are. All right. So if you notice on page 46, they kind of show you it's a transition from the Ppbe to the Defense Acquisition System. And it's also an introduction into next week's lesson. So I'm going to, yeah, it's kind of out of order, but let me try to put it in the right way. So remember when we did JSITs to identify capability gap, we being the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff under JROC, once they identify the capability gap, if it's a material solution, again, they're looking at .mlpf. They're looking at doctrine to see where the issue lies. Organization, training, material, leader development, or personnel, or facilities. What they're trying to determine, where does that capability gap lie? On page 46, if the capability gap and what it needs to fill that gap is a material solution, it triggers the Defense Acquisition System, and part of that system is the introduction of the Defense Acquisition Board. The board is then run by the USD for Acquisition and Sustainment, right? Because remember that was the senior person in charge of acquisition. So the USD ANS is the chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board under the Defense Acquisition System, that third system. And oh, by the way, if you didn't catch it, the vice chairman, who is the chairman of JROC, is also the co-chair on this third system. So he's the chairman of, the vice chairman is the chairman of the first system, JSIDS, and then he's the co-chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board in the Defense Acquisition System. All right, so if I haven't cleared that up, feel free to email me or send me a note so I can clarify that in a message or something. All right, 2147, the JROC, again, Joint Requirements Oversight Council is the, you could say, the forum, the board that helps the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff do the analytical process in the JSID to identify and make recommendation in that initial capabilities document. So they know what it is that we want to get done, so they publish an initial capabilities document to say, based on our strategy, based on the plan, these are the items that it will take to fill that capability gap. So here's an initial capabilities recommendation document. Okay. All right. They talk a little bit on page 2149 about the PresBud. So remember, the president's budget, and some of this, again, is based on the knowledge that you would have picked up in the earlier lessons. So if I might go over some of the stuff that I expect you to know, so bear with me. But based on page 49, remember, on the budget side, the president is required by law to submit the budget for that upcoming fiscal year to the president, from the president to Congress, no later than the first Monday in February. And when it goes to Congress, then there's several actions that take place. So before we get to the execution phase, even though they started on 49, I will tell you, once the budget gets to Congress and before we get the appropriation, there are several steps that goes through. You go through your committee hearings, your concurrent budget resolution, where they determine what guidelines they're going to use to go through the budget and what they're going to approve, what they're not going to approve. But based on, let's see, hold on. So at the top of page 51, let me explain. On the programming phase of P, when you submit your POM up and it gets to OMB level, And then it gets to Congress. The congressional authorizers are the House Armed Services Committee and Senate Armed Services Committee. They authorize programs. Let me repeat again, the top of page 2151. I'm a little bit under the weather, so bear with me. The House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee, they authorize the program in the POM phase. So even if funding is listed in the authorization law, we do not get budget authority from that process. Only authorize the program. So if you have a question, you see it again somewhere, and it says in the authorization law, you got $5 million. In the appropriation law, you got $2 million. How much do you have? You have 2. Appropriation is the only way we get funding. The second paragraph goes into the appropriation. The House Appropriation Committee and the Senate. Everything that happens in the House happens in the Senate. Senate Appropriation Committee. They are the appropriators for those 12 appropriations. And they will then give us, once it's approved, it gives us budget authority. So what is the end result at the budget execution phase? That is the issuance of that appropriation. So appropriation law is in effect. That is the final document in at the end of the budget phase, appropriation law. So even though when it comes to the congressional part, the final step before execution or the initiation of the execution phase is the appropriation law. This initiates, I'm writing it down, initiates budget execution. All right, so I'm going to pause for a few. I've been talking for a little bit. See, are there any questions on anything that we've covered thus far? Okay, so the rest of it now on the execution side is understanding that we get various appropriations as listed in the Future Year Defense Program to do the things that we need to do within the Department of Defense. On page 2153 starting and 2154, I like diagrams, easier, organized, is you can see the major appropriations that we deal with, MILPERS, O&M, RDT&E, procurement, and military construction. This chart's also good because it tells you that MILPERS and O&M are 1 year annual appropriation expense type. Then you have procurement and MILCON are multi-year appropriation, and they are investment type appropriation. What you also can learn from this chart, and I think this is the only place you'll see it, under O&M, it's telling you towards the bottom there of the O&M is that you can use O&M dollars to do minor construction up to $2 million. If you have an older study guide than the 2020 study guide, you might have a different dollar amount. The current study guide says minor construction up to $2 million and procurement of items or systems under 250, not more than 250,000. You can use O&M to procure items that's under 250,000. Also procurement on the right side where it says typical obligation. If you look, shipbuilding and conversion Navy is a procurement, however, it's a 5-year appropriation. What does that mean? 5 year, 2 year, 1 year. Those are the periods which these funds are available for new obligation. So page 55, annual, incremental, we already stated. Full funding policy. So incremental funding is RDT&E. Full funding is your MILCON and your procurement. Multi-year, advanced. So these are all straightforward. All right. So on page 2161, how you will see this information again will not be directly in this format. They will tell you what date it is. they will tell you what appropriation you just received. And based on, let's say if I give you RDT&E funding, I'm going to write the example of it. I'm going. All right, so you just received RDT&E funding. Today is the 18th of May, 2022, which means I'm in fiscal year 22. And they will say, okay, based on the appropriation life cycle, when will these funds be closed or canceled? So I will know that RDT&E is a 2-year appropriation. So I know that their phase 1 current in FY22, FY23. Every appropriation stays in the expired state for 5 years. So that's FY24, 25, 26, 27, 28. Which means these appropriation will be closed FY29. So that's how you will have to put this knowledge on page 2161 into test questions or exam questions based on knowing the life cycle of the appropriation. All right. Contract, MIPers, direct versus reimbursable. I'm not going to go over that. On page 2164, make sure you know the difference, and that chart's pretty good on the top of page 64 where it goes into project order versus Economy Act order. The key things you need to pick out: a project order, no deobligation at the end of the fiscal year. But if it's listed as an Economy Act order, you will deobligate the funds once that appropriation expires. What else? Project orders are used with services from another DoD entity versus Economy Act can be intra-government, another government entity. So just kind of compare the two so that you know the difference between a project order and an Economy Act order. Termination of contract. Let's touch a little bit on 2166. You can terminate contract either for contractor default or termination for convenience of the government, which that verbiage is typically already included in the contract. Contractor default means I hired the contract was given to company A, and company A have not fulfilled their portion. So based on the COR doing contracting officer representative doing what they're supposed to do, they'll be able to let the contracting officer know, okay, nope, they're not fulfilling the contract. So you got to fire that contractor. But whatever work up to that point that we've accepted, so be careful when you accept those acceptance of that job, is we have to pay them up to that point. Then we take the remaining funds to try and get another contractor. We may have to increase some of the funding to get that another contractor to complete the job. The key here with contractor default is you can't then turn around and get a second contractor to complete the job and then change the scope of what was already approved. So you got to be careful there. All right. So most of this is direct working capital funds. I'm going to touch a little bit on that on starts on page 2170. You may or may not see this again, but I do know that it seems to come up. So what is a working capital fund? If you look at the diagram on page 70, it's basically an organization that initially when they set up, they have a particular purpose in which they were set up. Let's say the commissary, since most people are familiar with commissaries. And they then take the funding that they have, they buy the food items to put on the shelf in the commissary, and based on what it costs them to get the food item, they determine a certain price that they have to charge the customer. And oh, by the way, they have an additional stipulation with the working capital fund. Is the goal of the working capital fund is to break even. So they cannot just charge whatever they want to in the working capital fund. They also have to look at prior year. Did they get a profit? Then they're forced to lower their prices. So if you notice, sometimes you go in the commissary, the price of an item is one thing, and then you go back a year later, it's much lower or much higher because of the working capital fund. So defense working capital fund, and it's just revolving. So that's why you have the revolving fund concept, is the fund that they receive from the customer when they charge you, they take that fund, put it back, and it revolves, continuously use it. And they, whatever they charge, they have to determine that ahead of time. So you have a lot of information between page 70 and 73 on working capital fund. I would say just review it in case it's something that I missed at that point. What can you do? And then I'm going to take it back because I think I want to, on page, let me see, before we got to that one. What can you do with funds when they are in the expired state? So I'm taking it back to current versus expired state versus closed state. When a appropriation enters the expired state, that 5-year period, the only thing you can do is make upward and downward adjustments. When the funds enter the canceled state, the funds are then removed to the miscellaneous receipts account in the treasury. However, there's a 1% rule that says if you have current appropriation of that type, you can use up to 1% of current appropriation to pay that bill that comes in, that invoice on that closed account. However, once that account is closed, we cannot affect or use any funding from the closed account. The funds are initially wiped and placed back to the treasury. All right, page 2178 goes into the availability of funds. So make sure you know the terms at the bottom of page 78, because if they give you a list of values and they say, what is the unobligated allotment? Like, what? So you got to understand the flow of funds and the order in which these things occur. So remember, Congress, I'm not going to look at this. I'm going to say Congress appropriates, OMB apportions, DOD issues allotment, then we commit, obligate, and we outlay funds. Not disbursement, we outlay. So based on that knowledge, if they say what's the unapportioned amount of the appropriation, well, the funds have been appropriated, but not all of it has been apportioned. So you have to know the order in the availability of funds. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. And we'll come back to the NAF in a minute. So if you look on the exercise on page 2181, they give you an example that you'll be given a list of values at the top for appropriation, apportionment, allotment. It may or may not be in the right order. So don't get used to things being in perfect order for you and all you got to do is, oh, that's so easy. I promise you, if you see it on the test, they'll probably have appropriation at the bottom, outlay in the middle. They'll mix it up. So know that it's appropriation, apportionment, allotment, and you could throw commitment in there, obligation, outlay. So like for the first example, it says they want you to compute the unapportioned appropriation. So it's basically just taking what's been appropriated, which is that 48 million, what's already been apportioned. If you subtract the 48 from the 24, then that will tell you what has not been apportioned. So make sure you kind of look at the exercise on page 2181. That will help you understand those languages. All right, let's go back to page 2179 and we look at the NAF funds, non-appropriated funds. So these are funds received at the installation level. There's some that are appropriated directly, and based on the category, there's some that the installation earns different ways. So we're going to look at that. All right. Category A funds. If that installation has Category A funds, that means 100% of those funds are appropriated. And they'll give you mission sustaining programs, and they'll give you a listing at the bottom to kind of give you some examples of some of those programs. Category A. On page 80, If it's a category B, community support program, it tells you what's the breakdown is 65% appropriated and 35% non-appropriated, meaning they have to earn those funds internally. And it tells you what are category B, right? Closely related in terms of supporting. They satisfy psychological and physiological needs of the service members. Category C, which is 100% NAF funds. And if you read through the descriptions, basically like your golf courses, your fishing, your hunting, the fee that they charge you, that's part of keeping that service going on the category C for that installation. So make sure you know what type of funding is either appropriated or NAF funding based on category A, B, or C. 100% appropriated, 100% NAF, or a mixture of 65-35. All right, let's see. So I think that is it for module 2.1. If you look at page 2182, which is the exercises, and 83, make sure you review those sections because they kind of help to trigger some of the questions that I've told you need to look at. And also as you're studying, they'll also help you to guide and know the types of questions you may be asked based on the knowledge that you have. So assuming, like they say on page 82, assuming today is 2 April 2018, first thing you got to say is what fiscal year are we in? Okay, so that's FY18. Which fiscal year of O&M is being executed? Then that should be fiscal year 18. So please review the exercises on those pages. All right, it looks like that's all I have for today. My work schedule have changed a little bit, so I'm in the building, but thank goodness for Facebook Live because we cannot access YouTube from the workstation. So hopefully the Facebook Live feed will be available, and I'll try to download it and put it on Facebook for the other individuals who are not on Facebook. All right, if you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube page at the CDFM study group, please go ahead and do so. Just kind of gives us more visibility out there so more people can find our videos as we try to help people to pass the CDFM exam. All right, I'm losing my voice, so this is my cue. Thank y'all for stopping by. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. I'll see you guys again next time as we go over CDFM module 2.2, cost and economic analysis. Thank you.